Come in. Shut the door gently behind you. Wherever you are right now, make a little space for stillness. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to stir the air. Let the shadows stretch a little longer than they usually do. And if you don't mind, drop a quick note in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from and what time is it? I always find it a little magical, knowing someone else is unfolding the past with me, halfway across the globe. Tonight, we're stepping into one of Europe's most tangled bloodlines, a monarchy built not just on castles and crowns, but on betrayal, war, religion, and something even deeper, identity. The Spanish crown. It wasn't born noble. It clawed its way into power, from the ruins of fallen empires to the burning clash of civilizations. This is the story of kings and queens, yes. But it's also the story of a land that has been broken and rebuilt more times than memory can hold. So settle in. Let's go back. Not just in time, but into the quiet corners of history that don't always make it into textbooks. The ones whispered in candlelight, passed down through trembling lips. Spain, before it was Spain, wasn't a country at all. It was a mosaic of territories, languages, peoples, and ambitions, held together by nothing but fragile borders and the echo of Roman collapse. The empire that once ruled the known world was crumbling, bleeding from its edges. Roads cracked, temples emptied. And across that twilight, from the dense forests of the north, came strangers with fire in their eyes. They were called the Visigoths. Not born of Iberian soil, but forged in the cold winds of the Germanic world. Warriors, exiles, and opportunists who had once dared to sack the eternal city of Rome itself. But that had been long ago. By the 5th century, the Visigoths were weary of wandering. Their eyes turned south to a wounded land that still pulsed with ancient power, Hispania. They did not come as guests. Through narrow mountain passes and blood-wet valleys, the Visigoths pressed inward. They seized, fought, negotiated, and slowly, piece by piece, claimed a kingdom. At its heart, the ancient city of Toledo, not yet the royal jewel it would become, but it stood like a stone sentinel, watching over the plains of Castile. Toledo became more than a capital. It became a symbol, a torch burning in the wreckage of Rome's legacy. From here, the Visigoths dared to do what no one else had yet achieved on the peninsula: unify. Not just land, but rule. Not just territory, but a crown. But unity here came not from peace, but from fear. This wasn't the chivalric court of fairy tales. The early Visigothic kings ruled by sword, shadow, and suspicion. Power was a shifting thing, passed not through bloodlines, but through blades. Kings rose through violence, and they fell the same way. Consider the story of King Liuva II, young, uncertain, and dead before his reign could harden, poisoned by betrayal. Or Record, the ruler who dared to convert the kingdom from Arianism to Catholicism, not out of divine vision, but cold, strategic foresight. Religion here was not just faith, it was leverage, a banner to gather or divide. It was under Recared's rule in the late 6th century that a turning point came. The Visigoths embraced the Catholic Church, aligning themselves not with their own people's traditions, but with the deeply rooted spiritual identity of the Hispanic Roman population. It was a move both brilliant and dangerous. With a single decree, he shifted the kingdom's soul. Imagine the weight of that silence, as cathedrals once shunned now rang with new chants. As nobles once loyal to the old gods whispered in corners, unsure where their loyalty should lie. The kingdom was reshaping itself again. But Recared's legacy, like so many in this dark chapter, came not with peace, but with tremors. His successors would struggle to hold on to the unity he had carved out, caught between a restless nobility and a church that now demanded obedience not just of faith, but of governance. The 7th century bled slowly. Kings came and went, often with a blade at their back before a crown could settle on their brow. Internal rebellion became as common as external threat. No one was ever truly safe on the throne. Every coronation felt like a gamble. And then came King Wamba, a name that sounds almost comical now, but in his time he was a giant. Stern, sharp-eyed, unforgiving. Wamba ruled like a general, not a monarch. He rebuilt the military, crushed revolts, and for a moment gave the kingdom something like stability. But even he couldn't outrun the shadow that dogged every Visigothic king: betrayal from within. He was drugged, forced into a monastic robe while unconscious, for in Visigothic law, a man who took holy orders could never wear the crown again. His enemies didn't need to kill him. They just needed to strip him of his sword and his title. That's how fragile monarchy was here. A drink, a robe, a whisper in the dark, and an entire kingdom changed hands. Still, the Visigoths endured. Not out of love, not out of loyalty, but because no one else had yet risen strong enough to take their place. Their reign was built on the edge of a blade, but that edge was beginning to dull. By the early 700s, cracks were no longer whispers. They were chasms. The court at Toledo was bloated with intrigue. The church, once an ally, had become a rival power. The nobility was fractured. And then, over the Strait of Gibraltar, came news that would change everything. A new force was stirring in the south, swift, disciplined, and ablaze with purpose. The armies of Islam, led by generals who spoke of one God and carried the banner of a new empire, had swept through North Africa like wildfire, and they had set their sights on Iberia. But that part of the story, that's for next time. For now, close your eyes. Listen to the quiet hum of the past still echoing through stone, the clang of swords in forgotten courts, the whispered plots beneath candlelight, the breath of a kingdom teetering on the edge of something far greater and far more terrifying. If you haven't already, take a moment. Dim the lights a little more. Let the screen glow like a hearth in a dark room. Maybe light a candle. Let the flicker remind you that this story, like flame, dances and devours all at once. And if you're watching from a place where this history still whispers through the stones, drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far the echoes reach. Last time we stood in the fading light of Visigothic rule, a kingdom born from chaos, held together by sharp minds and sharper swords. But every empire has its dusk, and this one was staring straight into it. The year was 701, a year that would come to be carved in memory like a scar. Across the narrow waters of the Strait of Gibraltar, the world was changing, fast and without mercy. The Islamic Caliphate, not yet a household name in Christian Europe, had exploded across continents. In less than a century, it had risen from the deserts of Arabia to swallow empires whole. Persia, Egypt, the Maghreb, gone or folded into its embrace. But this was no horde. It was a storm with direction, a movement driven by faith, law, and ambition. And now it had reached the very southern edge of the Iberian Peninsula. And here enters a man. A name you may not know, but you should. Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general in service to the Umayyad Caliphate, commander of a modest force, sent not to conquer, not at first, but to test, probe, push the cracks. He landed at a rock that would one day bear his name, Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar. And with him, a small army of hardened men and a vision that glimmered just out of reach. But why now? Why did the Caliphate strike? Why Iberia? Because the Visigoths were already bleeding. King Roderick, the last king of the Visigoths, had seized the throne in the wake of a brutal succession. Not everyone accepted him. His claim was fragile, his enemies many. The kingdom was not united. It was rotting from within, and the smell of decay always draws scavengers. Some say the Muslims were invited. There are whispers, hushed in monastic scrolls and echoed through Arabic chronicles, that factions within the Visigothic court, angry at Roderick's rise, opened the door, promised gold, promised access, promised chaos. Whether true or not, it hardly matters. The result was the same. Tariq moved swiftly, crossing into Iberia with fewer than 10,000 men. And there, on the banks of the Guadalete River, fate caught fire. It said the battle raged for days. The Visigothic army, larger and on familiar soil, should have held the line. But Roderick was betrayed, some say by his own nobles, who turned their banners mid-fight. The king vanished, likely drowned in the marshes, his body never found. and with him, the last breath of the Visigothic crown. Tariq didn't hesitate. He pressed north. One city fell, then another. Córdoba, Toledo. Entire regions capitulated not just out of fear but calculation. The Muslim invaders were fast, but they were also strategic, often sparing local leaders in exchange for loyalty, taxes, and relative peace. And in a land exhausted by civil war and royal corruption, many saw this new power not as conquerors, but as a reset. The old world was dying, and something else was pouring in to take its place. This wasn't just a military conquest. It was cultural, religious, architectural. With the Muslim arrival came language, Arabic script etched into walls and parchment. Came knowledge, ancient Greek texts preserved and translated, carried across sand and sea. Came design, arches that stretched like the ribs of heaven, gardens watered with wisdom from Damascus and Baghdad. And just like that, Spain was no longer Spain. It was Al-Andalus, a new name for an old land, now reborn under the crescent moon. But here's where the story deepens and darkens. Al-Andalus wasn't simply the story of Muslims ruling Christians. It was a tapestry, tangled, fragile, and often blood-stained. For centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived under this new order, sometimes in harmony, sometimes under duress. But they lived side by side. Languages mingled, ideas flourished, tensions brewed. And far to the north, in the rugged mountains of Asturias and beyond, pockets of resistance held on. Tiny Christian enclaves hiding in the mist, peasants turned warriors, lords who still whispered the name of Roderick as if it were sacred. They refused to accept this new world, and from those mountaintop strongholds, a slow, stubborn fire began to burn. It would take centuries, but it would not go out. Still, in the beginning, the tide belonged to Al-Andalus, and in the shadow of Córdoba, which would grow into one of the most dazzling cities in the medieval world, the memory of the Visigothic kingdom withered like old parchment. The crown was gone, but the idea of a Christian Spain, a united Spain, wasn't dead. It had simply been buried beneath centuries of conquest, waiting. Do you hear it? The silence after a fall? The stillness when one world ends and another begins? In that long, aching breath between eras, the Visigoths are no more. Their tombs crumble, their language fades, but in the bones of ruined churches, beneath the mosaics of old palaces, their ghost still lingers. And the land they lost? It is now part of something bigger, something stranger. But remember, empires rise fast, they fall faster, and Al-Andalus will not last forever. Not with that northern fire growing stronger. But that's a tale for another night. When you're ready, I'll tell you how a single bloodied banner carried through mountain fog would become the spark for one of the longest wars in European history. Let the candle burn low. Let the wind press against the windows. The past is still breathing. If you're in a quiet place, lean into it. Let the hum of the screen become your only light. If you're near a window, crack it open. Feel the air. Let it remind you this story isn't sealed in parchment. It breathes. It lingers. And if you're watching from somewhere steeped in stone and silence, maybe the Basque Highlands, the Scottish moors, or the Andalusian hills, leave your city in the comments. Let's trace this journey together, one place at a time. When we left off, the world had changed. Al-Andalus had risen like a new dawn over the Iberian Peninsula, its cities glowing with calligraphy and conquest. The Visigoths were gone, their crown lost in the reeds of the Guadalete. And yet, not everyone had surrendered to the light of the crescent moon. Far to the north, where the terrain grows jagged and the sky feels closer to the earth, the story hadn't ended. It had only gone quiet, waiting to be rewritten in the fog-drenched mountains of Asturias. Here, in a land of forests and rain, the bones of resistance took shape. He wasn't a king, not in the beginning. He was a survivor, a shadow from the old world. Pelayo, a name carried through legend like a whispered oath. Some say he was of noble Visigothic blood, a former bodyguard to the last kings. Others believe he was little more than a rebel with nothing to lose. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: Pelayo did not kneel. Around 718, while the Umayyad forces spread across the peninsula, Pelayo gathered a handful of warriors and vanished into the cliffs. These weren't polished knights. They were farmers, hunters, fugitives. Men who remembered the old kingdom not with nostalgia, but with grief, and when the time came, they struck. At Covadonga, a narrow gorge surrounded by steep rock and roaring silence, a Muslim detachment marched in, expecting to put down a nuisance. What they found was something older, more dangerous. People who knew the land like breath, who knew silence like a weapon. The ambush was brutal. Arrows rained from above, boulders tumbled like thunder. The invaders never stood a chance. What emerged from the smoke wasn't a nation, but a message. We are still here. Covadonga became the ember at the heart of what would become a centuries-long wildfire, La Reconquista. Not a single war, not a clean crusade, but a slow, grinding return, part holy mission, part political survival. Not just to take back the land, but to reclaim identity. Pelayo didn't live to see that dream grow, but his defiance lit a path others would follow. Asturias, once a ghost of the Visigothic past, grew into a Christian kingdom of its own. Small, stubborn, and surrounded by enemies, but alive. And in the centuries that followed, more sparks caught flame. To the west, Galicia and Leon. To the east, the Pyrenean frontier where Carolingian hands shaped Catalonia. In between, Navarre, the Basque valleys, and eventually Castile, so named for its watchful stone towers, a kingdom born to stare down the frontier. None of these kingdoms trusted each other. They warred, they schemed, but they shared one instinct, one direction: south. South, where Al-Andalus glittered. South, where cities like Córdoba sang with fountains and fire. South, where the memory of Roderick still haunted stone and the idea of Spain waited to be reborn. But Al-Andalus was not waiting idly. In the 10th century, it reached its zenith. Under the rule of Abd al-Rahman III, it declared itself a caliphate, not just a province, but an empire in its own right. Córdoba, the capital, became a city of light in an age of darkness. Its libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its streets were paved and lit by oil lamps when Paris still stank of rot. Poets, physicians, and philosophers walked beneath its arches. This was no fragile kingdom, this was power. And yet, something was breaking. Because empires rarely collapse from invasion, they rot from within. After Abd al-Rahman's death, Córdoba began to fragment. The caliphate cracked into smaller kingdoms called taifas, each ruled by its own emir. And while they were cultured, wealthy, and often tolerant, they were also divided. They fought each other, betrayed each other, paid Christian kings to fight their Muslim rivals. It was in this moment of fracture, not weakness, but instability, that the north surged. Asturias had grown into Leon. Leon begat Castile. Aragon stirred. Navarre took shape. Slowly, year by year, they began pressing downward. Not just with swords, but with marriages, alliances, patience. Cities fell. Fortresses changed hands. The language of conquest was no longer Arabic alone. But in the midst of it all, a man emerged. Not a king, not at first. A warrior, a mercenary. His story is a storm of contradictions. Loyal and exiled. Christian and ally to Muslim rulers. A man who served power, not dogma. But make no mistake, he would shape the soul of Spain. A mirror held up to the fractured land itself. But that's not where we are. Yet. For now, hold on to this. The Reconquista had begun, not with fanfare, but with a whisper in the mountains. The kingdoms of the north, once scattered and bruised, were stirring, and though they still fought each other as often as they fought the south, something had changed. The Christian dream of a united Spain, distant, desperate, half-formed, was no longer dead. It was dreaming, and dreams, once they take root in blood and stone, have a way of surviving. So rest if you can. Let this part settle in your chest like old smoke. The kingdoms are rising, the caliphate cracking, and somewhere, in the dust between them, a warrior is sharpening his blade. Next time, I'll tell you how El Cid became both the sword and the shadow of a nation not yet born. Until then, stay in the quiet. The past is still whispering. You know what to do by now. Let the lights dim. Let the silence settle in your chest, like dust in an old cathedral. Maybe it's night where you are. Maybe there's rain ticking against your window. Perfect. The kind of quiet that lets the past come whispering through. And if you're somewhere old, maybe your town still has Roman stones beneath the pavement or a ruined castle in the hills, drop your location in the comments. It's strange how often history circles back to places that never ask to remember. Last time, we traced the slow burn of the Christian North, Asturias, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and Castile, pushing downward against a fractured Al-Andalus. We stood at the edge of something vast. The Reconquista had begun. But this wasn't yet the Spain we know. These were scattered hearts beating separately in the dark, each one dreaming of the same thing, dominion. And now, in that chaos, one figure begins to rise. Rodrigo Díaz de Vivar, El Cid. But to understand Rodrigo, to feel the weight of his story, you have to forget the myths. Strip away the statues and the schoolbook gloss. Forget the polished name etched in marble. The man who lived wasn't born into greatness. He carved it piece by bloody piece in a land with no room for mercy. Rodrigo was born around 1043, near Burgos, in the Kingdom of Castile. He wasn't royal. He was nobility, but not high enough to be safe, not low enough to be invisible. He walked a tightrope from the moment he could hold a sword. His father was a knight, a man of war. Rodrigo inherited that fire. He trained not just in arms, but in the complex rituals of Castilian court life, a brutal dance of allegiance, suspicion, and ambition. By his early 20s, Rodrigo had already made a name for himself. He fought with fury, but also with control. He understood the art of spectacle, of symbol. In a time when kingdoms traded power as easily as words, Rodrigo was named El Campeador, the champion. He earned it not just on the battlefield, but in ritual duels, fighting for his king's honor against other nobles. But loyalty in Castile was a fragile thing. Rodrigo served Sancho II, a fierce and driven king who sought to unite Leon, Galicia, and Castile under one crown. And for a time, Rodrigo was his most trusted sword. He led armies. He crushed resistance. He carried Sancho's ambitions like a banner into war, until it all fell apart. In 1072, Sancho was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, perhaps at the gates of Zamora, perhaps by people who knew his ambitions had become too dangerous. Power passed to his brother, Alfonso VI, a man Rodrigo had once fought against. Suddenly, El Campeador was no longer a champion. He was a threat. What followed wasn't a fall, it was an exile. Rodrigo was cast out of Castile, stripped of his titles, banished from court, left to wander a kingdom that no longer had room through. But here's where the myth truly begins, because Rodrigo didn't disappear. He adapted. In exile, he did what most Christian knights would have considered unthinkable. He offered his services to Muslim rulers. He rode for Zaragoza, a powerful taifa in the northeast, and not as a guest, as a mercenary general. A Christian leading Muslim armies against other Christian lords. A man of the cross, fighting for gold and survival beside the crescent. Why? Because this was Spain in the 11th century. Lines weren't clean. Faith was a banner, yes, but often one of convenience. The Reconquista was not a crusade, not yet. It was a chessboard of shifting alliances, where loyalty bent like smoke and power was the only constant. Rodrigo became a master of that chaos. He fought with brilliance, he learned Arabic, he studied the customs of his allies, and in doing so, he became something rare, not just a warrior, but a bridge, a liminal figure, too Christian for the Muslims, too Muslim-friendly for the Christians, trusted by no one, feared by everyone. Eventually, Rodrigo returned north, reconciled, carefully, with Alfonso VI. But the king never fully trusted him again. And Rodrigo? He didn't need a king anymore. He had tasted something else, independence, command, destiny, and so he turned his eyes south to the city of Valencia. Valencia, rich, strategic, fractured. It was ruled by Muslim forces, but torn by internal strife and weakened by the collapse of centralized power. For Rodrigo, it was an opportunity. Not for service, for sovereignty. He laid siege to the city in 1092. It wasn't swift, It wasn't noble. It was long and bitter, filled with starvation, deception, and blood. But in 1094, Valencia fell, and Rodrigo ruled it, not as a vassal, not in someone else's name, as a king in all but title. He ruled over Muslims and Christians alike. He maintained Arabic advisors. He allowed mosques to function, even as churches were restored. He minted coins. He held court. He governed. Not by conquest alone, but by intelligence, by respect, by force. And for 5 years, Valencia became something astonishing. A hybrid court, a fragile coexistence, a glimpse of what Spain might have been. Had power not always demanded purity. But peace in Spain never stayed long. Rodrigo's reign was tested constantly, by rival taifas, by jealous Christian nobles, and most dangerously, by a new force rising from the African coast. The Almoravids. They were not fractured. They were not tolerant. They came in waves of black-veiled warriors, preaching a purer, harsher Islam. And with them came the collapse of the Taifa Compromise. City after city fell, and Valencia stood in their path. Rodrigo met them with fire. But in 1099, after years of defiance, Rodrigo died within the walls of his city, not in battle, not with a sword in his hand, but slowly, from illness, a quiet end for a man made of storms, and yet, even in death, he defied defeat. Legend says that when the Almoravids surrounded Valencia after his passing, his widow, Jimena, dressed his corpse in full armor, strapped him to his horse, and led one last charge from the city gates. The ghost of El Cid riding into battle. Truth? Maybe, maybe not. But in Spain, truth often bows to legend. Eventually, Valencia was lost. Jimena fled. The city returned to Muslim control. But Rodrigo's story endured. He became more than a man. He became a myth, a symbol for the Reconquista, for courage, for complexity, for that strange, beautiful, brutal Spain that was never one thing and never easy. Next time, we'll watch the kingdoms rise higher. We'll follow the march of crusaders, the fall of Toledo, the slow weaving of a Spanish identity still fractured by blood and ambition. Wherever you are, cold apartment, candlelit room, quiet bus ride through the city night, let it all fade out. The noise, the news, the now. Close your eyes just for a second and feel the weight of it, that pulse you've been following, the one that began in Visigothic halls, bled through the swords of kings, echoed under the hooves of El Cid's warhorse. It's still here. It hasn't faded. It's getting louder. The death of Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar in 1099 didn't mark a pause in Spain's story. It marked an acceleration. The ground was shifting, and the forces that had once been scattered, Christian, Muslim, African, Iberian, were beginning to collide with terrifying momentum. Let's return to the Christian north, to Leon, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre. Once divided, always suspicious of one another, these kingdoms were changing. Slowly, painfully, they were starting to think as one, not in language, not in law, but in longing. Longing for what had been taken. Longing for what had never truly been theirs. Al-Andalus. To the south, the Muslim taifas were unraveling. The death of El Cid had left Valencia open, and soon the city was retaken by Muslim forces. But not the kind that had once ruled with tolerance and poetry. These were not the Umayyads of Córdoba. These were the Almoravids, rigid, militant, born from the burning deserts of North Africa, and behind them, waiting in the shadows, something even more unforgiving, the Almohads. These were not kingdoms, they were waves. They didn't negotiate, they didn't tolerate, they came to cleanse. And as they swept through Al-Andalus, replacing fragmented courts with religious absolutism, they triggered something equally radical in the north. Unity. To fight a holy enemy, the Christian kingdoms needed to become something they had never been before, aligned. And the first true spark of that unity came in 1085, before El Cid's death, when Alfonso VI of Castile and Leon captured the city of Toledo. Toledo, once the Visigothic capital, then a jewel of Al-Andalus, a city of science, of libraries, of mosaics and minarets. Its fall was a shockwave. It wasn't just a military win, it was symbolic, a sign. a whisper in the ear of Christendom that maybe, just maybe, Spain could be Christian again. But victory bred panic. The Muslim taifas, fearful of collapse, had invited the Almoravids into Iberia to help repel Christian advances. It was a decision born of desperation, and one that quickly backfired. The Almoravids didn't just help. They took over, replacing diplomacy with doctrine, leniency with law. Suddenly, the Christians were not just fighting fragmented kings. They were fighting a unified, theocratic war machine. And for a while, it worked. The Almoravids pushed back hard. They crushed Christian armies at Sagradas in 1086. They regained control of major cities, and for nearly a generation, they held the line. But history, especially in Spain, moves in rhythms, and the Almoravid rhythm would not last. In North Africa, another wave was rising. The Almohads, fiercer, stricter, more fanatical. They swept through Morocco and Algeria, toppling Almoravid cities, burning anything that stood in their way. And by the mid-12th century, they crossed into Iberia, bringing a darker storm with them. What followed was one of the most terrifying periods in the peninsula's memory. Cities that had once embraced pluralism, places where Jews, Christians, and Muslims had coexisted, were now purged. Churches were torched, synagogues were razed, philosophers were silenced. The past was being rewritten with fire. But as the darkness grew in the south, something else stirred in the north. A dream. A dream of reconquest, yes, but not just of land, of identity. And that dream found its flame in a kingdom many had once dismissed, Aragon. Small, isolated, mountainous, but ruled by something rare, vision. Under Alfonso the Fern, known as El Batallador, the battler, Aragon became more than a border kingdom. It became a weapon. Alfonso launched campaign after campaign against the Muslim south. His victories were swift, sometimes brutal. He captured Zaragoza in 1118, a jewel city that had once rivaled Córdoba. He declared himself not just king of Aragon, but king of all Spain. He wasn't wrong to try. But like so many in Iberia, Alfonso died without an heir, and what he left behind wasn't unity. It was confusion. His kingdom was divided, his title meaningless. And once again, the dream of a united Christian Spain flickered. Still, Aragon did not vanish. It adapted, and in time, it would find its strength not just through conquest, but through marriage, through diplomacy, through subtle empire. But that's still to come. For now, we're in a moment of imbalance. The Christian kingdoms are stronger than they've ever been, but still divided. The Muslim South is ruled by foreigners, Almohads who have no connection to the poetry or science of Andalusian Islam. And caught between these two storms, the people, the farmers of Toledo, the booksellers of Córdoba, the translators, the monks, the exiles, the children, those who knew no flag, who spoke in both tongues, who lit candles in silence while the walls shook from war. Their names are mostly forgotten, but their lives were the thread, the bridge between empires, the ones who endured when kings fell. Next time, we'll stand at the edge of another fire, a reckoning. The Christian kingdoms will finally unite, but only through love and death. And in the heart of Andalusia, one last Muslim dynasty will rise and fall under the weight of 1,000 years of struggle. But tonight, let it rest. Let the wind carry the echo of El Cid through the broken stones of Valencia. Let the towers of Toledo remember the moment they changed hands, and let Spain sleep, for now, with both sword and prayer beneath its pillow. Take a breath. Maybe refill your glass, pull the blanket tighter, or just lean back and listen. Because now, we're entering the final turn, the long, slow crescendo that will give birth to something the world hasn't yet seen. But not yet. First, we watch it break. Where we left off, Spain wasn't Spain. Not yet. It was still a patchwork of ambition and memory, stitched together by war and prayer. Aragon, Castile, Leon, each forging their own destiny with fire and steel, never quite able to let go of the past, or each other. But sometimes the most brutal wars don't happen on battlefields. They happen in beds and between bloodlines, and so we come to union by inheritance. a political marriage that changed everything. In 1150, Petronila of Aragon, just a child, was married to Ramon Berenguer IV, the powerful Count of Barcelona. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even peaceful. It was strategic. The fusion of a rugged mountain kingdom with a rich coastal empire. Together, they would create a hybrid realm, the Crown of Aragon. And with it came ports, fleets, and a new kind of Spanish power, Mediterranean, outward-facing, mercantile. Not just swords, but ships. While Aragon expanded eastward, into Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of Greece, Castile looked south. It stared down the heart of Al-Andalus and saw not fear, but fate. The real turning point came in 1212. It was called the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, and it wasn't just a clash, it was an eruption. The Christian kingdoms, once fractured, stood together, briefly, under one banner, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, a rare moment of unity. And across the field, the Almohads, that grim, austere empire from North Africa, dug in. They had ruled Andalusia for nearly a century. They thought the Christians weak, divided. They were wrong. What happened at Las Navas wasn't just a defeat for the Almohads. It was a collapse. The Muslim line shattered. Entire divisions fled. The path to the south opened like a wound. And with it, the end of Muslim Spain became not just possible, but inevitable. But this isn't just a war story, because while the kingdoms marched and walls fell, something quieter was happening, a slow weaving, a cultural stitching. In Toledo, Christian scholars were translating Arabic texts, philosophy, medicine, astronomy. Books from Damascus, Baghdad, Cairo, passed through Jewish hands, translated into Latin, whispered into Europe. Without Spain, the Renaissance may never have come. And yet, this same Spain, this land of layered tongues and tangled gods, was sharpening its edges. With every conquest came resettlement. Churches replaced mosques, Latin replaced Arabic, crosses replaced crescents. It was called repoblacion, repopulation, but it meant something darker, erasure, not overnight, not always by sword, sometimes with laws, sometimes with silence. But the idea of one Spain, one faith, one crown, it was beginning to grow. And in the kingdom of Castile, a man was born who would embody that vision with brilliance and brutality. Fernando III, later called El Santo, the Saint. He ascended to the Castilian throne in 1217, and by 1230 he had united it with Leon, completing the internal unification of the central Christian heartland. For the first time in centuries, Castile and Leon were one. Fernando wasn't just a king, he was a force. Between 1236 and 1248, he tore through the south. He took Córdoba, once the shining capital of the Umayyads, then Jaén, then Seville, a city of poets, orange trees, and endless stone courtyards. Each conquest was a blow to Al-Andalus, not just military but symbolic. One by one, the great Muslim cities fell, and with them, the memory of a once great civilization. Fernando didn't live to see the end. He died in 1252. But his legacy was a map, a redefined Iberia. Christian dominance was no longer a dream. It was a shape on parchment, a kingdom with ports and towers and ambition. The Reconquista was almost complete. Almost. There was one last fragment of Al-Andalus still standing. Granada, small, surrounded, mountainous, but cunning. In 1238, the Nasrid dynasty rose to power in Granada. And for the next 2.5 centuries, against all odds, because Granada didn't resist by strength. Why? It resisted by strategy. The Nasrids made deals. They paid tribute. They sent gold, artisans, even soldiers to Castile. And in exchange, they were allowed to live, to rule, to build. And what they built was breathtaking. The Alhambra, a palace not of walls but of whispers. Every inch a prayer in stone. Calligraphy dancing across marble. Fountains echoing under arches. Rooms built like poetry. While the rest of Al-Andalus fell into memory, Granada created something defiant, a beauty so delicate it made conquest feel like blasphemy. But beauty is not armor. The Christian kingdoms, especially Castile, were changing again. No longer just warriors. They were becoming administrators, bureaucrats, empire builders. And their gaze was narrowing, fixed on that last sliver of Muslim Spain. Soon a marriage would change everything again. A union not of children, but of kingdoms. Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella of Castile. But we're not there yet. Not quite. The pieces are still moving. The south breathes barely, the north sharpens, and Spain, the Spain we recognize, waits just beyond the horizon. Next time, we'll stand in the final century of Al-Andalus. We'll watch palaces crumble, armies ride, and the last Muslim king of Granada weep as his city falls. But for now, let the fountains of the Alhambra whisper one more verse. Let the shadows in Seville remember their Moorish walls, and let Spain sleep again. Balanced for the moment, between beauty and fire. Maybe let the room go quiet. Let your eyes rest. Let the hum of your thoughts fall away. Because where we're going now, it's not loud. It doesn't begin with war drums or victory marches. It begins in silence, in longing, in the shadow of something once beautiful and already doomed. Granada, the last breath of Muslim rule in Iberia, the final ember of Al-Andalus. For over 2 centuries, the Nasrid kingdom of Granada endured, a soft thread in the tightening noose of Christian Spain. It wasn't the largest nor the strongest, but it was clever. It survived because it adapted, compromised, paid. It bowed where others had bled. In the courts of Castile, Granada was tolerated, not embraced. Treated like a vassal, a minor king clinging to luxury and poetry while the world turned against him. But within its borders, something strange happened. Culture bloomed. The 14th century in Granada wasn't just a time of defense. It was a time of creation. The Alhambra reached its full glory, not a castle, but a dream. Walls covered in verses, domes like the night sky, courtyards where the wind whispered through orange blossoms. It wasn't just architecture, it was defiance, beauty used as resistance. And yet every fountain that flowed did so under the weight of coming ruin. Granada was surrounded, by land, by law, by time. The Christian kingdoms no longer squabbled. They no longer waited. They were watching, preparing, and soon a marriage would set everything in motion. 1469. Valladolid. A quiet wedding. No great fanfare, no roaring armies. Just 2 people, 2 signatures, and the end of an age. Isabella of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon. They called it a union of crowns, not of countries. Castile and Aragon would remain technically separate, different laws, different currencies, different customs. But in truth, the marriage was a revolution. A single mind with 2 swords, a northern alliance that finally had the strength, the legitimacy, and the faith to complete what generations had tried, the Reconquista. But Ferdinand and Isabella weren't just monarchs. They were reformers, planners, and believers. In 1478, with papal approval, they established something darker than any battlefield, the Spanish Inquisition. It didn't begin with blood, it began with fear. Its goal wasn't war, it was purity, religious uniformity, and its first targets weren't Muslims, but Jews, particularly conversos, Jewish families who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, and were now accused of secretly practicing their old faith. The Inquisition moved slowly at first. Interrogations, confessions, property seized. Then the executions came, then the fires, in plazas, in the silence of night, in public and in shadow. Fear became law. This wasn't just about heresy, it was about control. Ferdinand and Isabella didn't want a Spain of many voices. They wanted one Spain, one church, one king, one queen, and soon, one final conquest. Granada, the last sliver, the quiet holdout. Its Nasrid rulers, weakened by internal strife and dynastic infighting, could feel the walls closing in. They had no allies left, no golden age to retreat to, only marble halls and the echoes of calligraphy. In 1482, Castilian forces began their campaign. This wasn't a raid, it was a siege by erosion. Years of pushing, isolating, capturing surrounding towns, cutting supply lines. Slowly, methodically, they tightened the ring. And all the while, inside Granada, a king fell. Abul Hassan Ali, the Nasrid ruler, was deposed by his own son, a young, ambitious prince named Muhammad Durtin. The Christians called him Boabdil. He would be the last Muslim king of Spain. In 1491, after nearly a decade of war, Boabdil signed the Treaty of Granada. Terms were given. Muslim subjects could keep their religion, their laws, their customs, for now. The surrender was graceful, dignified, but final. And on January 2nd, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada. They climbed to the Alhambra, raised the cross where the crescent once flew, and Boabdil, the last emir, left the city in silence. As he rode away, he looked back at the palace of his ancestors and wept. His mother is said to have told him, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." It's a brutal line, but maybe she didn't see what he saw. A civilization dissolving into dust. 1,000 years gone. It's a year the world remembers for other reasons, because as one age died, another began. That same year, under the new banner of a unified Spain, Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic. The old world was now whole, and the new world was about to be broken open. But before we go there, sit with this. The Alhambra still stands. The calligraphy still sings. But the people who built it are gone. Their language, their law, their light, swept away by the tide of conquest and faith. Next time we cross the ocean, we follow Spain into the unknown, gold, glory, and genocide. But tonight let Granada rest. Let the last breath of Al-Andalus echo in the mountain air, and let the moon hang over the red walls of the Alhambra, whispering stories no one remembers how to translate. The fire's low now. The room's quiet. That's how it should be. Because where we're heading next, nothing will sound the same again. What began in the shadows of Iberia is about to echo across oceans, across jungles, deserts, mountains, into places untouched by European feet. And the name that carried swords and scripture through its own soil now carries ships into the unknown. Spain. The year is 1492, and the fall of Granada has barely settled when Queen Isabella receives a visitor, a man with wild eyes and salt in his blood. He carries no crown, no land, just a vision and a map no one quite believes in. Cristóbal Colón. Christopher Columbus. He isn't Spanish, he's Genoese, but he's persistent. And he speaks of Asia, of spices, gold, and the untold riches of a new route west. For years he begged monarchs across Europe. All refused him, until now. Because now Spain is hungry, unified, triumphant, and ambitious. In August 1492, 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, slip from the harbor of Palos. Small, fragile, creaking with faith and desperation. They are not just ships, they are Spain's first whisper to the rest of the world. What they find is not Asia. On October 12th, they land on an island in what we now call the Bahamas. Columbus calls it San Salvador. He thinks it's the Indies. He's wrong. But it doesn't matter, because gold is seen, and men are taken. The people who greet them, the Taíno, come with gifts, with open hands. Within years, their numbers will collapse. Enslaved, beaten, ravaged by disease, a civilization erased before Europe ever learns how to pronounce its name. And Columbus, he sails back triumphant, with parrots, spices, a few chained souls, and the promise of empire. Spain doesn't hesitate. Over the next decades, conquistadors, part warrior, part explorer, part merchant, will fan out across the Americas like fire over dry grass. Men like Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Pedro de Alvarado, names burned into both glory and infamy. In 1519, Cortés arrives in Mexico. He meets the Aztec Empire, a society of temples, laws, astronomy, and blood. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, is a city on water, more dazzling than anything in Europe. Cortés doesn't marvel, he calculates. He allies with enemies of the Aztecs. He exploits divisions. He takes Montezuma captive. And in 1521, with the city in flames and the canals clogged with corpses, he destroys Tenochtitlan. On its ruins, he builds Mexico City. Pizarro follows in Peru, crushing the Inca Empire, a civilization of engineers and sacred roads, by capturing its king, executing him, and unleashing chaos. These weren't just conquests, they were fractures in the soul of the world. and behind them stood Spain, not as a crusader now, but as an empire. Back in Europe, the gold begins to flow, by the ton, from the Andes, from the rivers, from the skin and sweat of enslaved hands. Galleons return to Seville, heavy with silver and sorrow. Spain becomes rich, unimaginably rich. Kings walk through palaces lined with American gold. Churches rise, wars are funded. Europe watches with envy and fear. But no wealth comes without a weight. The native populations collapse from disease, war, slavery. Entire languages die in a generation. Temples are leveled, gods forgotten, and in their place, crosses are planted in the soil. Spain does not just conquer land, it conquers memory. Missionaries follow the soldiers, Dominican, Franciscan, Jesuit. Some bring kindness, many bring fire. They burn codices, they rewrite histories, they baptize children who don't know the words they're saying. And yet, something unexpected happens. Even as Spain devours, it also transforms. The Americas begin to change Spain itself. New foods, chocolate, tomatoes, potatoes, flow into Europe. New rhythms, new colors. Paintings in Madrid now feature parrots. Scholars write of lands once called Eden, and Spanish identity stretches, twists, becomes something more than just Gothic and Christian and royal. It becomes imperial and haunted, because while palaces glitter in Madrid and Valladolid, the ghosts begin to pile up. In the jungles, in the mines, on the decks of ships where kidnapped Africans scream into the sea. Spain's empire, like its history, is built on contradiction, glory and brutality, faith and cruelty, civilization and destruction. And within all this, the monarchy grows fat and complicated. The Habsburgs rise, a royal family not of Spain, but of Austria, through a marriage arranged years earlier. Charles I of Spain, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, inherits an empire so vast, the sun never sets on it. He's a Spanish king who barely speaks Spanish, but he rules the world. And under him, the Inquisition spreads. The wars continue. Protestantism rises in the north, and Spain becomes the sword of Catholicism. Not just at home, the dream but of a pure, powerful, universal Catholic empire becomes Spain's obsession. But dreams cost. As gold flows in, inflation rises, the economy cracks, wars become endless, enemies multiply. The very wealth that made Spain mighty begins to rot it from within. But not yet, not here. This is still the age of power, of conquests and cathedrals, of ships heavy with treasure and kings cloaked in divine right. And the Spanish monarchy, that ancient thread we've followed since Visigothic days, now sits on the world's tallest throne. But the higher you climb, the further you fall. Next time we follow the cracks. We watch the empire bleed. We witness revolution, rebellion, and the slow unraveling of a golden dream. For now, close your eyes. Picture the sea. A ship in the mist, gold in the hull, and chains below deck. That's the cost. That's empire. That is Spain. The gold doesn't shine the same anymore. It's still pouring into Spain, from the mines of Potosi, the jungles of Colombia, the mountains of Mexico. But now it drips like poison, feeding wars, feeding debt, feeding a monarchy stretching itself so far across the globe that it forgets how to walk at home. This is the 17th century, and Spain is trembling, not with fear, not yet, but with exhaustion, like a giant who's been standing too long on legs that were never meant to carry this much. The Habsburg dynasty still rules, still clutches the world in its grip. Charles V is gone now, but his legacy echoes. His son, Philip II, takes the crown, and with it, inherits the most powerful and unstable empire Europe has ever seen. Philip is no warrior king. He's cold, reserved, deeply Catholic. He rules from his granite palace, El Escorial, a place more tomb than court. There's no laughter there, just silence, shadows, and strategy. And under his rule, Spain doubles down. On war, on faith, on control. The Inquisition sharpens its knives. Heretics are rooted out with growing fury. Books are banned, secrets whispered. Fear becomes a permanent citizen. But outside those cold halls, the world is changing. In 1588, Philip launches his greatest gamble, the Spanish Armada, a fleet of nearly 130 ships sent to crush Protestant England and dethrone Queen Elizabeth. It's a show of force, divine justice at sea, but the wind does not serve God that day. Storms scatter the Armada. English ships, smaller, faster, strike like hornets. By the end, half the fleet is gone. The myth of Spain's invincibility sinks with it. Still, the empire limps forward, through smoke, through faith, through inertia. But the cracks are spreading. In the Americas, the silver mines are depleting. Native labor systems collapse. Enslaved Africans are trafficked in rising numbers, the transatlantic slave trade becoming a brutal artery feeding Spanish greed. In Europe, Spain bleeds gold into endless wars. Against the Dutch, the French, the Ottomans, and even itself. It spends more than it earns, borrows more than it can repay. Bankruptcy isn't a threat anymore. It's a cycle, 4 times in 50 years. And at home, the monarchy weakens. Kings become shadows, sickly, indecisive, bound by court factions and family intermarriage. Bloodlines fold in on themselves. The royal jawline tightens, the mind softens. Its sleep is no longer peaceful. The Habsburgs, once proud and sprawling, begin to consume themselves. And then comes the last of them, Charles II, el hechizado, the bewitched. He is king in name, but broken in body and mind. The product of generations of incest, Charles is frail, sterile, and mentally stunted. His court is paralyzed. His rule, tragic. The empire, in slow decay. And yet, no one knows how to stop it. When Charles II dies in 1700 with no heir, the Spanish throne becomes a battlefield. Not just of politics, but of Europe itself. The War of the Spanish Succession ignites. France wants its prince, Philip of Anjou, on the throne. The rest of Europe, Britain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch, fear a Franco-Spanish superpower, so they fight, hard, everywhere. From Italy to the Netherlands to the Caribbean, blood spills for a crown. And when the war finally ends in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, Spain survives. But it's not the same Spain. The Habsburg era is over, and from its ashes rises a new dynasty, the Bourbons, imported from France, younger, smarter, sharper. They bring with them Enlightenment ideas, science, centralization, modern government, but also repression, because even now Spain is terrified of collapse. The Bourbons inherit an empire in slow motion. An empire with wealth, yes, but stretched thin, hated in its colonies, fragile at its core. They try to fix it. They reform the army, modernize the tax system. They build roads, encourage education, and curb the power of the church. But something deeper is unraveling. A whisper, a question. What is Spain without an empire? In the Americas, that question is becoming louder. In Peru and Mexico and Venezuela, people are watching the revolutions in America and France and beginning to dream, not of kings, but of freedom. The 18th century becomes a slow fuse. And by the time the 19th arrives, Spain's colonies are ready to explode. But here in the heart of Spain, the monarchy still dances, still holds masquerades in the royal palaces, still signs decrees with trembling hands and powdered wigs. They don't hear it yet. The footsteps, the pounding of hooves, the scream of revolt. But it's coming. And the Spanish crown, once built on gold and faith, is about to face something even stronger. The will of the people. Next time we stand in the storm. Napoleon arrives, the colonies rise, and Spain begins to lose everything it thought it could never live without. For now, rest in the twilight. The empire is still breathing. Its sleep is no longer peaceful. After centuries of conquest, gold, and divine rule, the Spanish crown finds itself surrounded not by enemies in distant lands, but by the weight of its own decay. And in the distance, thunder rides on horseback. Napoleon, its 18 weight. Spain, still grasping for control, becomes a pawn in a game it no longer understands. France invades. Napoleon installs his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, a foreign king in the heart of the empire. It's more than insult, it's betrayal. But the people don't stay silent. From the mountains to the cities, Spaniards rise. Not soldiers, but guerrillas, civilians turned warriors, mothers hiding rifles under floorboards, priests delivering sermons with gunpowder beneath their robes. What follows is not a war. It's a reckoning. 6 brutal years of resistance, ambushes, massacres. A nation fighting not just for a king, but for its soul. And they win. In 1814, Napoleon falls. The Bourbons return. Ferdinand VII is crowned again. But the Spain he inherits is not the one his ancestors ruled, because while Spain bled at home, its empire unraveled. Across the Atlantic, revolution has already taken root. In Mexico, Simón Bolívar in Gran Colombia, José de San Martín in the south, names once whispered in fear now roar through plazas and battlefields. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals and tired of royal chains, Spain's colonies rise like waves. And one by one, they break away. Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru. By 1830, Spain, once the greatest empire on earth, has lost nearly everything it conquered in the New World. But it doesn't end with bloodshed. It ends with silence, with ships returning empty, with palaces growing cold, with maps being redrawn without Spanish hands. Back in Madrid, the monarchy staggers on. Ferdinand VII, reactionary and fearful, undoes the progress of liberal reformers. His death in 1833 sparks a new civil war, the Carlist Wars, battles not for territory, but for the crown itself. Competing claims, fractured loyalty, a country cannibalizing its past. The 19th century becomes a blur of coups and constitutions. Monarchs come and go. Some are loved, many are hated. In 1868, the people rise again and exile Isabella II. The monarchy briefly disappears. It returns, like a ghost, with Alfonso XIII, and then his son Alfonso XIII. But it's never whole again, never trusted, never stable. And then comes 1931. The monarchy is overthrown. The Second Spanish Republic is born, a new experiment, a final breath of democracy. But the rift between ideologies, between fascism and freedom, tradition and change, is too deep. In 1936, Spain tears itself apart. The Spanish Civil War. It's not just a conflict, it's a crucifixion. Republicans, nationalists, communists, anarchists, foreign brigades, Nazi planes, Stalin's spies, cities bombed, villages purged, brothers against brothers, churches burned, poets murdered. And when the smoke clears, one man stands. Franco, a general turned dictator. He crushes the republic, bans opposition, executes thousands. Spain becomes a graveyard for memory, for freedom, for truth. And the monarchy? It becomes a symbol, not of power, but of exile. Franco keeps a tight leash on the idea of kingship. He raises a boy, trains him like a son. That boy's name is Juan Carlos, a Bourbon, bred in silence. And when Franco dies in 1975, after nearly 40 years of rule, he hands Spain back to the monarchy. But something unexpected happens. Juan Carlos doesn't bring back dictatorship. He brings democracy. He helps guide Spain into a new era, a constitutional monarchy with elections, freedoms, and a future. It shocks the world, and for a moment Spain breathes. But history has its patterns, and kings even now are not immune. In the 21st century, scandals return, corruption, secrecy, public anger. Juan Carlos abdicates in 2014. His son, Felipe VI, takes the throne. But the Spain he rules is fractured again. Catalonia seeks independence. The wounds of civil war remain unhealed. Monarchy itself is questioned, not by swords, but by votes, by voices, by memory. And here we are, from Visigothic kings to Islamic caliphates, from conquistadors to exile, from empire to republic to dictatorship to democracy. Spain's monarchy has endured nearly 1,500 years, not because it was invincible, but because it knew how to adapt, to disappear when it had to, and to return when it was least expected. But now the question remains, does Spain still need a king? That's not for history to answer. That's for the people, for the silence between each election, for the echoes in the streets of Barcelona, Madrid, Seville, because monarchy is not just about crowns. It's about memory, myth, and the stories we choose to keep, and the ones we finally let go. The story is finished, but history is never done. Now dim the lights, close your eyes, and listen to the stillness Spain leaves behind. It's not the end. It's just the quiet before another chapter begins.